So here's part three. Again, we're still talking about sheep and cattle industry and changes within agriculture, Arkansas Valley. I'll give you a heads up for those respect as far as when we get to slide three, the crop grown for livestock feed. We're talking about meat. So those who feel very strongly in ethical or moral concerns there, I'll just wanted to give you heads up. Nothing graphic though. I just thought at least throw out there the aspect of meat as far as within historically a Western diet and portions of that within agriculture in Arkansas Valley, and a lot of that demand from the eastern portion of the U.S. So I wanted to go ahead and briefly describe what, in regards to providing within agriculture to livestock, what they eat, cattle or sheep. Forage, for example, or fodder. Uh, that term is used here as far as what they eat either out on the land during a certain time of year or growing season, such as the grass that's already being grown out there. Fodder, pretty much the noun in regards to the forage, but most specifically what is grown and then provided to them at a later point and how that is prepared. Like during the winter season, in regards to snow on the ground, they can't get to it, and so the ranchers literally go out there with bales of hay, for example, or hay, um, or whatever. There's also where they actually ferment particular type of grasses or yeah or greeny kind of products that's grown during the growing season and then uh, fermented and stored and fed. Okay, so let's just go ahead and move on there. I thought I'd just provide some terms for you. So really need to look at here is within the cattle and sheep grazing as it got closer to the 20th century, but really it was a change in aspect of the land as we've seen before, and the when there was what was the relationship there? Really, it was a very short amount of time. Really, it was the open range. As long as that was still there and space to roam, cattle ranchers and sheep herders got reasonably along, but only for it was pretty a short period uh, because um, really it once the range was closed, uh, that was that was the end of the amicable relationship. And once homesteading started and fences came up and homesteaders started doing dryland farming, and then the homesteaders up and down in the valley and increased for a bigger need for water. Um, so why didn't they get along after the range was closed? So it is really specifically how the sheep and the cattle ate the grass. So the sheep themselves, when they eat grass, uh, the forage, when they do forage, all right, they eat down to the ground, below, to the subsurface of the soil, and they trample and bed immediately over that which they just ate. And so, in the short term, that immediately just the soil is just comes loose, and the grass vegetation does not have a chance to recover within a short term, as opposed to cattle who go out there. They do some still trampling, but the immediate effect is not there yet, and there's a much better chance for the soil and the grass to recover and grow back, um, as opposed to the sheep. So yeah, they chomp on that grass pretty hard, and this is where the animosity was, where when the range closed and more closer proximity, and sheep herders trying to be in the same land, grazing with the cattle wasn't going to work. And the cattlemen, the ranchers responded very quickly and very violently. So you had the sheep wars, um, just trying to, of course, they were very wanting to, very strong sense of what their land was. Okay, the cow owners. Uh, so a lot of this violence, unfortunately, was directed towards those who were working as the sheep herders or worked on the sheep ranch, and that was Mexican nationals, Mexican Americans, and the Nuevo Mexicanos within here in the area, southern Colorado. So really, this is again another area of labor and this sense of uh, fighting against protecting a way of life that was being dramatically threatened, at least within the aspects of the ranchers. So that is one thing to consider. Next part then, okay, so here's the slide I was mentioning. Again, I just wanted to let you know, just providing this within a historic perspective, because this is a connection towards what we'll see with the cash crop, sugar beets. It really was change within the cattle and the sheep industry towards the latter part of the 19th century. Really, it was just because of the closing of the range and the way the cattle and the demand for a certain type of food and the meat, uh, that taste basically uh, within that Western diet. So there was decision made to within there to find a way of fattening up the sheep and the cattle. Alfalfa was one of those things that was decided to grow, and of course with alfalfa, that different type of a forage, a fodder. So as we described here in just a moment ago. So with alfalfa, there was a bigger demand for water. Okay, in Arkansas Valley, uh, alfalfa was used to fatten both uh, the cattle. All right, and in most aspects with the sheep. Um, Cattle then was not transported to areas where there were other grass, but instead feedlots that had the alfalfa stored and fattened up and then processed. Of course, there's the meat, and of course with that there's difference in taste and tenderness. So excuse my again. But then the sheep, of course, their initial growing, with the raising of sheep as an industry with the wool, that was on the outside part of their skin that provided that for clothing. But because it changes within the textiles, that that demand declined, and then of course the lambs, again, fatten them up and their meat, eat. So really that changes there too. So that's alfalfa. So it's really unfortunate, we're looking at the later part of the 19th century here, okay? And, those from the East and that particular type of diet, all right? So as we get to the next slide then, like I said, with alfalfa, there was the more demand for water. And there is where, for really the center point here is Rocky Ford. And the building and enlarging of and greater distance of the diversion of that water. So the first large scale project, permanent nature then, was in Rocky Ford in that respect, and alfalfa. Here we'll see in a moment, we'll begin to see other aspects. So Rocky Ford then became where, by 1874, the priority was a larger amount of water here. Here is just specific to 100, like 111 second feet by 1874. All right. Really, of course, we're starting to see more before alfalfa, or at least within aspects from the 1870s, 1880s, was then the alfalfa here towards that part, as I described within the Western diet previous slide. Um, Really, though, that diversion and larger project of water being diverted in Rocky Ford had to do with really pioneer as far as agriculture there in Arkansas Valley and Rocky Ford. Um, as you see here, though, as far as at the time he wrote a letter to President Theodore Roosevelt in 1893 touting sugar beets. We'll get to in a minute. But in order to convince the community of Rocky Ford, he found out we did not have the people to grow the beets to maintain a plant. So we went to work encouraging the growing of small stuff such as melons, cantaloupes, tomatoes, pickles, and other small stuff to encourage the settlement of the country. So in 1873, we commenced to build our first canal. In 1875, we got our ditch out to my place. Rocky Ford put out 40 acres of almost all kinds of grains and vegetables. So here you see the introduction of what you probably would see traditionally within agriculture. And of course, Rocky Ford's now famous for cantaloupes and watermelon, but also bringing in the canning industry like tomatoes and pickles. All right. So really, so you see this expansion from the 70s and into the 80s, but really as he was touting sugar beets, it was where in 1887, 1888, the ditch was enlarged in Rocky Ford to a total length of 16 miles. In 1890, it irrigated 7,968 acres. A considerable percentage of which was planted to alfalfa. So this was really actually, by that time, as you see here, that was very indicative for the whole area, Arkansas Valley and Arkansas River. Okay, to such a point where the demand for water outpaced the amount output for the Arkansas River. And as you see with what you've already read in Max McCoy's book, and a little bit here with getting to legacies of dust, dryland farming, that it got to the point to where the state of Kansas, as the Arkansas River rolled into the state of Kansas, there wasn't much left for the farmers there. And they sued. The state of Kansas sued the state of Colorado back in the 1890s or 1900, right at the turn of the 20th century, saying, hey, what about our rights to the water ourselves? So you saw that as Max McCoy described it. So really, the introduction of sugar beets is you see how that connection was made, especially with the swink at Rocky Ford, and really it was bringing that aspect into the state of Colorado. Much of the 30-year or 40-year period at the second half of the 19th century was where Peter Magnus was looking into the sugar beets being grown in the whole state because of the aridity. And you see how Swink came on board on that in the Rocky Ford area. But it was Peter Magnus that really started to push for that. And by the turn of the century is when there was a proliferation and support as sugar beets within as an industry. And of course, this is something that we will I'll bring to the table here on Thursday in an aspect of intensive labor. We're with sugar beets real quick though. You'll see how you have to thin them in right to make sure, which means weeding after you plant them in August, and so that way there's gives them opportunity to soak up the sun and be more sweet. And then of course then topping later on in the growing season so as not to prevent them from going to seed. All right. Of course, that really, I'll finish up here this last slide. And with this need for labor and to do these things, the thinning and weeding and topping, there was a need for labor. And of course, this is where we finally get to, well, I finally bring to the table here now to labor and migrant labor. Now, don't this is okay. So this is picture about the same time period, or yeah, early part of the 20th century, and so really, of course, now before that, and we'll talk about this later on, was first there was actually the German Russians that came in first when they introduced sugar beets to the Arkansas Valley. Okay, so let me finish up with this. I hope that this is reasonably clear. You see the connection from how the cattle and sheep industry evolved and transitioned over to how the effect because of demands and within the Western diet in meat, okay, and of course alfalfa and how the within agriculture the particular product was grown because not direct market to human beings but to livestock, okay, and then the much more demand for water and much more need to divert that water at greater distances. Of course, aspect of dryland farming and bringing in the homesteaders. So here, I hope that brings into the here for now and then now to Thursday. Okay, so I'll finish it up here. And thanks a lot.